This trip was organized by Max and Jane Carter. It was a 15-day trip to what is variously called Palestine, or the occupied West Bank, or the Holy Land, or now, by Israelis and many in the Jewish community, Judea and Samaria. Max recently retired from Guilford College in Greensboro, North Carolina, and has been organizing these trips for over 30 years. His first experience in the area was in 1970 when he went to teach at the Ramallah Friends School for 2 years. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Quakers have had a school in Ramallah since 1869. Yes, that's 1869. So the Quakers have had a presence in Palestine for a long, long time. Hanan Ashrawi is a graduate of the Friends School. And here is a photo of everybody that participated. You can see where I am. This guy, though, is not part of our group. This is Mustafa Barghouti. He should be the president of a united Palestine and Israel. This guy is amazing. This is Mohammed. I don't remember his last name. He teaches math at the Friends School, and he acted as our fixer. He did all the logistical groundwork that needed to be done in order for us to get from one place to another and to see this person and that person. It was amazing. And he has recently been elected onto the city council of El-Bireh, which is the sister city of Ramallah. Through the years, Max has made many contacts throughout the area, and on these trips tries to set up meetings with as many different points of view as he can. And the purpose of this trip is to listen. For those of you who know me, that is not a strong point of mine. Listening is not what I'm good at. But I did listen, and I asked a lot of questions, which I'm sure you would think. So I want to devote the majority of the time today introducing you to some of the people we spoke with and to hear what they had to say. Along with that, I will of course throw in my observations, and together at the end I will answer questions and hope we can have some kind of civil discussion. I'll present about 1/4 of the people that we spoke to. We spoke to a lot of people there. There is no question that in this area there are conflicting narratives of what happened and what the situation is. And the first two people that I will talk about are Israeli citizens, and the second two are Palestinian citizens. On our second day in Palestine, we visited Senior Kibbutz in northern Israel. It's in Israel. Our contact there, Lior, and that is his son, is a short, stocky man in his mid-40s who grew up on the kibbutz. His parents were with the first group of people to start the kibbutz, and they did that right after the 1967 war. The kibbutz sits just a mile from the Lebanese border and a mile from the Golan Heights. And the people who started the kibbutz refused to put it into the Golan Heights, even though the government wanted them to, because at that time the Golan Heights was not Israeli territory. Israel had not annexed it yet. And they wanted to be 100% in Israel. Lior, as a child, was growing up during the Lebanese war. And he remembers spending night after night after night in the bomb shelter, hearing bombs exploding above him. He did his military service and then left to Israel to see the world, something he says is very, very common. Although he was gone for 8 years, he returned every year to fulfill his month-long reserve duty in the Army. He has been called up for frontline duty during both Gaza wars. He's a member of an elite unit, and he remembers standing on the exact same hill in each of the wars, surveying the unfolding situation. He remarked to his commanding officer that if he was standing in the exact same place a second time, there is something very wrong with the situation. But that is as critical as he gets of his government. Lior is an incredibly open, frank human being. He was a delight to talk to. He fielded all the questions. He has his point of view, and he has no problem with verbal confrontation and holding his own. He holds positions that are both expected and unexpected. Expected, of course, there is no partner for peace from the Palestinians. Unexpected, there is also no partner for peace from the Israeli side. Nobody in the Israeli government wants to make peace. The kibbutz has no synagogue. It never has had a synagogue. And they recently even voted to keep it that way. But Lior said God decides about the land. So I don't know where that puts him religiously, or what. After the Roman expulsion of the Jews in year 135, there's evidence that there were 270 synagogues built on what is now the Golan Heights. And Lior says that means that Israel has a right to have that land. However, Palestinians expelled from their homes 70 years ago, he says, is a fact of history, and we should move on from there. So you see those contradictory viewpoints that he has to justify the existence of what he's in. Mona, who we met midway through our trip at the Jerusalem Hotel, grew up an observant Jew in the Midwood section of Brooklyn and made Aliyah. She moved to Israel in 1991. She had all she needed in Brooklyn but lacked any purpose in life. Moving into Israel made her feel part of something much bigger than herself. She lives in an Israeli settlement outside of Jerusalem, and although she is sad that she has no longer has any contact with Palestinians, because after the second Intifada, the intercourse between the two were completely shut down. Barriers were created, so there was no ability for Palestinians and Israeli to interact. And she knows that that is a hindrance to actually coming to peace. But she lays the blame solely on the Palestinians. She loves the phrase that we're all familiar with: the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. We offered you peace, we offered them peace a number of times, and they refused to accept it. When pressed, Mona didn't think that a one-state solution, I should say, was possible for two reasons. First of all, demographics are against maintaining a Jewish majority in a one-state solution, and that makes all Jews fearful. Secondly, really, she said, there's no real pressure to do anything but maintain the status quo because, and I'll quote her, we have a good life here and all the things that one can hope for, end quote. So although there are some inconveniences, the Israelis, even in a settlement which is bounded by the military, have a good life. They feel good about, they have all the material things they need to have a good life and to raise their family. She does acknowledge that the Palestinians don't have a good life and that they live under military law. She did concede when I asked and pressed that a one-state solution might work if Israel would actually come to have a constitution, which it never has had. A constitution which ensures, of course, religious freedom and equal treatment of all people. But, you know the phrase as well, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. The Israelis have never been able to come to terms with what a constitution would say. Later in our visit of the 15 days, we met with Mohammed Shataya. He's the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure for the Palestinian Authority. Now, this guy was very into facts and figures. He was very into maps. He was very into all the things that have happened. Why he is the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, I don't know. Because that's what I wanted to hear about, but he was not interested in talking about that. In 1917, only 2% of the people living in Palestine were Jewish. By 1947, 32% were Jewish, and they controlled only 6% of the land, and that land was given to them by the British government. The 1948 partition gave 52% of the land to the Jews, who made up 32% of the population. And a total of 481 Palestinian villages were leveled during the Nakba, and 750,000 people were made refugees. If you do the math, that's about 1,500 people per village. Over 650,000 Jewish settlers have moved into the West Bank and Jerusalem since 1967, and 2.8 million Palestinians live in the West Bank. But he couldn't really speak to why Ramallah looked like a dump. And there were mansions going up in Ramallah for the echelon, but the common people lived in hovels. This is the Minister of Housing for the PA. Infrastructure. They're totally dependent on Israel for electricity. Palestine only has 2 resources that I could see: sun and stone. Beautiful stone if you've ever worked in stone. No solar. No solar. The infrastructure, the housing, the infrastructure minister couldn't tell me why there was no solar power in Ramallah, an area completely controlled by the Palestinians. So anyway, but on a much more human level, and I found this very interesting, Mr. Shataya related his very recent, the week before, attempt to take his family to the Dead Sea. It's a place where we as a group had gone just a few days earlier with absolutely no hassles whatsoever. But if you're Palestinian, you can't get there without going to Jordan first and going to the Dead Sea from the Jordanian side. Unless, like Mr. Shataya, you have 3 different passes. He has a pass that gives him, because he's part of the Palestinian Authority, 24-hour access to any area in Palestine. However, his family doesn't have that pass. Only he has that pass. So he had to go through 3 different checkpoints before he found some Israeli soldier who would say, take your family to the Dead Sea. 3 checkpoints to do that. Now here's the guy who should be the president. This is Mustafa Barghouti. He was born and raised in Jerusalem. He trained and practiced as a physician. Now, because of the laws Israel instituted after the annexation of Jerusalem in 1967, any non-Israeli resident of Jerusalem who is not living in the city for 5 or more years loses the right to live or visit there. Dr. Barghouti is barred from returning to his city of birth. This Dr. Barghouti is the leader of the Palestine National Initiative, the PNI. It's a political party not aligned with Fatah or Hamas. He ran for president in 2005 against Abbas. And frankly, he would have been a much better president. Here are 4 maps of Palestine, which he showed us. The one on the far right is the one instituted by the UN in 1947 with the UN resolution. This gives the Palestinians 45% of the territory, even though at the time they were 68% of the population and legally owned 93% of the land. But the UN gave them 45% of the land. Now, in 1988, the PLO finally accepted a 2-state solution. Before that, they were insistent on a 1-state solution. We should live together. But in 1988, they accepted a 2-state solution, and that is what was codified in the Oslo Accords. And that 2-state solution gave them, in the Oslo Accords, 22% of the land. Less than half of what the UN had said they should get. And then, when the stalling happened with the implementation of the Oslo Accords, remember, the final implementation was supposed to be in 1999. And they went to Camp David with Clinton, and Ehud Barak was there, and this is what he offered them. He said, we'll give you 18% of the land. And now, with the continuing expanding of their settlements and the building of the wall, the territory that is now designated to be Palestinian is down to 11% of the land. This is what Mona says when she said, we made offers to the Palestinians and they didn't accept them. Is this acceptable? Since 2000, Israel has demolished 86,000 Palestinian homes, uprooted 1.5 million trees, most of them income-producing olive trees, and most of that was because of the building of the wall, and jailed almost 1 in 2 Palestinian males. The West Bank is approximately 2,270 square miles. That's this West Bank. And there are 700 military checkpoints throughout the West Bank. That is a checkpoint every 3¼ square miles, which in my mind is like every 10 miles there's a checkpoint. And we certainly witnessed that when we tried to go from Ramallah, because we were at the Friends School, that's in Ramallah, and we went to places that were in Israel and through Israel. So we experienced that travel difficulty. And sometimes travel is impossible. It's always difficult because you're always running up against checkpoints. The checkpoints are always crowded. Barghouti calls for 4 things: nonviolent, peaceful resistance, the international community support for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, Palestinian unity. He did not elaborate on how that. We had limited time. He didn't elaborate on how he thought he could achieve that. And helping people on the ground in Palestine survive the occupation, doing what Dr. Shataya, the Minister of Housing and Infrastructure, was not. What we are asking as Palestinians is for our human rights. Max, the guy who organized the tour, seems to be somewhat a conduit for students going from the Ramallah Friends School to Guilford College, since he taught at Ramallah Friends School and he also taught at Guilford College. We had dinner in the homes of a half dozen of these students and spoke extensively with their parents. This family is an evangelical Anglican family. That's a weird designation to me. Anglicans, I don't think as evangelicals, but let me tell you, there were more icons in this house than I've seen in churches. And here we have, of course, a very westernized Jesus, doesn't look Semitic at all, as the Good Shepherd. And here we have an etching of Palestine. So this is a Christian home, very religiously Christian, and the 2 things are very compatible. This is Marabou, the father, his wife, and his mother-in-law, or the wife's mother. Marabou's father was in the oil business and was actually, he said, my father was a millionaire. But he lived and grew up in a Palestinian town, the father, that was going to become part of Israel. And in 1948, the Israelis cleared out all of the Palestinians from that town and obliterated it, making his father's family refugees. Because of his connections, he didn't go to a refugee camp. He relocated to Ramallah, which is where Marabou grew up. Marabou, during the second Intifada, his wife and 2 children, they were living in Ramallah in a corner house. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, there came a pounding on the door. Israeli soldiers ordered them to leave. They were going to use the house as a headquarters because it was a corner house, a really good location. His wife asked for a little time to wake and dress the 2 children, and they were given 3 minutes. Marabou kept asking, but where should we go? Where should we go? And finally, the captain said, do you have a car? He said, yes. Go stay in your car. So to the car, the 4 of them went. And in about an hour, an Israeli soldier comes to the car, orders Marabou out, tells him to kneel down as if he was praying, and then proceeds to crouch behind him, firing his weapon, obviously using him as a human shield. After about 20 minutes of intermittent shooting, there was no return fire, the soldier orders him to drive away. But where to? Where's safe? The soldier points his weapon at him and just repeats the order. So he gets back in the car and starts weaving very slowly around tanks and armored personnel carriers. A Palestinian ambulance approaches coming from the opposite direction, stops and says, what in the world are you doing? Realizing that this guy is in really mortal danger. And Marabou explains, what's going on. And the ambulance driver says, wait here, wait right here. We're going to pick up a woman who's going to deliver a baby. We're going to take her to the hospital. When we come back, follow us back to the hospital. Just follow us back to the hospital. And so they did. And they reached the relative safety of the hospital. And then later that morning, they made their way to their mother-in-law, the mother-in-law. And there they stayed for 2 weeks till they could move back into their home. On our second Friday, we went to the mosque closest to the Friends School. I've never been really in a mosque before or went to Friday prayers, so it was a wonderful experience. But we met with Sheikh Fadl an hour and a half before the Friday prayers. The sheikh had spent some time in an Israeli prison, but spoke for over an hour and about a half an hour about Islam, stressing that it is a religion of peace, and how it is essential that the resistance to the occupation be nonviolent. He didn't really tell us anything about Islam that we didn't know. It was just the same old fodder over and over again. But during the question and answer period, it got a little interesting, because one of us, not me, had the sense or the chutzpah to say, so why were you in prison? What happened? What did you do? And it turns out that in 2005 they had the national elections, and the whole Palestinian, council or whatever, I'm not sure what the overarching thing was elected, and he and 50 other representatives who were elected were arrested. He didn't say that there was any other reason. I don't know that there wasn't any other reason, but that was the reason he said that he was arrested. And so then I did say, so, okay, you were arrested, how were you treated? And he kind of joked a little and evaded, but finally he told us how he was treated. He described being hooded and shackled to a chair for 45 straight days with very loud music blaring behind him 24/7. He was unable to get more than a couple of hours sleep under those conditions. He was periodically beaten. And after those 45 days, now honestly, I don't know in those conditions how you can count days, but he said that after 45 days, he was in a cell measuring 9 by 6 with 14 other people. 14. Now, I have a room that I rent out that's 9 by 8, and you can't get 14 people sitting down in that room, which means that you had to sleep in shifts. Pretty uncomfortable. Located in the Aida refugee camp, Al-Rawad, it's a word that means pioneers for life, and it spearheaded the concept of beautiful resistance when it began operation in 2000, using the arts to express resistance to the occupation rather than violence. They engaged children and teens in theater, music, the visual arts, photography, the cinema, to explore their society and their hopes and dreams. They also operate a fully equipped learning center. It was just wonderful to go up there and see kids playing, to see them reading, to see them just being kids. The founder, Abdel Fattah Abu Sar, was born in the camp. In fact, he has the keys to the house that his parents were forced from. He was educated in France, but interestingly, it took him 7 applications to the Israeli government to allow him to leave to be educated in France. But his persistence finally paid off, and he was able to go for France. He was in France for 9 years. He got an advanced degree in biology, but he also studied theater. And so he chose to come back and to start this organization because, as he said, we don't want to celebrate death. We want to celebrate life and give hope that there can be a better future. Historically, Palestinians have practiced more than 300 forms of non-armed resistance. And the fact is that 99% of Palestinians have never carried a gun. He said, we want the world to see the true face of Palestinian resistance. Now, he does affirm, because we asked him, that international law gives an occupied people the right to armed resistance. But he has chosen a different path. He has chosen a peaceful path of resistance. Breaking the Silence is made up of former IDF soldiers who have given testimony about the reality of controlling a civilian population under occupation. Their stated aim is to end occupation. These Israeli citizens believe that Israel has a right to exist and want to have a strong, defensible state. Our guide to Hebron was Akia Schatz. He's a former IDF soldier. He served in an elite unit in Hebron, and that elite unit was tasked with infiltrating Palestinian society to do 2 things: to spy on them and to carry out occasional assassinations. He is unapologetically Israeli. but feels that the occupation undermines the security of Israel. One of his unit's final tasks in basic training, this is in basic training, was to carry out a search for weapons and contraband. This was done by identifying a Palestinian home where no evidence was there of any wrongdoing at all. It's a training session afterwards, and they don't want their soldiers to get hurt. So in the middle of the night, the soldiers show up at this Palestinian home, pounding on the door, gaining entrance and lining everybody up, father, mother, all the children. The residents are held at gunpoint while some of the soldiers go through everything in the house looking for contraband. The children, of course, are screaming in terror. The parents are beside themselves with fear. Having found nothing, of course, they leave. Akia says this is standard operating procedure. Its real purpose, he says, is to maintain terror among the Palestinian population, that they are never safe and the military is always watching them. Now, for those of us of my age, this mirrors perfectly the United States standard operation procedure in Vietnam. A company of newly arrived soldiers in Vietnam would go to a village known to be passive, evict all of the residents, and burn down the village to the ground. That was standard operational procedure. And what was its effect? We know what its effect was. It made people who might have been for our presence, and certainly those who were neutral to our presence, it turned them against us. And you don't think that that's what's happening in Palestine? Duh, of course it is. They are making the exact same mistakes that we made. Probably from, learning from our playbook, right. Okay, back to Hebron. Hebron is a city of 200,000 Palestinians and 800 Israeli settlers. Note that there are Israeli settlements outside the city proper as well, and housing thousands of Israelis. But inside the city itself, there are 800 Israeli settlers and 200,000 Palestinians. Now, the settlers inside Hebron have Israeli soldiers to protect them and to act as a buffer. This is Akia interacting with the soldiers because he wants to show us stuff, but he has to get their approval to let us go into these restricted areas. The settlers complain about mistreatment by the Palestinians, and the army then evicts all the residents from a given area to try to minimize the contact between the two. That area is then called a sterile zone. The sterile zones have expanded as the settlers attempt to control more and more area. But note, the settlers don't get to move into a sterile zone either. It's literally a sterile zone. There's no activity to it. Welcome to Shahuda Street. Now, this is just a small example of it. We are in the heart of the old city, in what used to be a bustling market area. There are hundreds of markets that were shut down and boarded up because they are now in a sterile zone. And this is just an example of part of this Shuhada Street. Now, this market, this is on Shuhada Street too. This market is, again, in the heart of the city, and the settlers claim this particular series of markets should be Israeli because the property was owned by a Jew who lived there in 1929. 1929, if you remember, was the time of the riot in which 133 Jews were murdered, killed, and 110 Palestinians died as well. Conveniently left out of the Israeli narrative are the 350 Jews who were sheltered by their Arab neighbors during that riot. Now, the British then moved all of the Jews out of Hebron for their own safety, they said. About 17% of the population. And the owner of this series of shop, who was Jewish, he then rented it to Arabs in his absence, because no Jews were there, so he rented it to Arabs. And it is his grandson that currently has title. So an Israeli does indeed own this property now. And until the settlers moved in, he was renting it to Arabs and gaining, income from it. But because the settlers' agitation now shut the whole area down, he no longer is gaining anything from it. It sits empty to everybody. Akia then led us up a street and through a Jewish settler neighborhood. On the periphery stood one lone Palestinian house. It's been turned into a community center that houses youth against settlements in Hebron, an organization finding creative ways to publicize the situation in Hebron, including educating youth in photography and video arts, website production, all with the objective of publicizing to the world what is happening in their home city. They're pursuing their open Shahada Street demonstrations in an attempt to draw attention to what is happening in Hebron. Now, moving on from Hebron, one of the towns near Ramallah that we visited was Belin. It sits right along a line that the wall is being built on. The problem is that the wall is now cutting off most of the town's agriculture and grazing lands. For 10 years, the people of this town have held regular demonstrations. At first, they were daily, which have always been met with violence. In fact, there have been more people arrested than there actually are people in the village. That's because they've enlisted international help to join in the demonstrations, and they actually took their case to the Israeli Supreme Court, where they won a partial victory. The wall was rerouted, giving them half of their land back. You can see the wall, but they continue to struggle for the remaining portion of the lands, but that's not going to happen because the wall is now built. You can see the wall right there, and right behind the wall is going up an Israeli settlement, right behind the wall on the property that used to be part of their grazing and agricultural lands. Interestingly, the wall is not encroaching on any Israeli territory. It is only encroaching on Palestinian territory. The Mar Elias Educational Center in Ibelin in northern Israel. This is a city in Israel, but it's a Palestinian city in Israel. It's a school, basically, that was started in 1965 by the local highly respected Archbishop Chakur. He's now retired, of the Orthodox Church. In the city of Ibelin, it is both Muslims and Christians. And he started the school so that Christians, Muslims, Druze, there's a small population of Druze in Israel, and Jewish children could learn together and see each other as equals. At the founding of the school, there were a fair number of Jewish students, but now there are no Jewish students. And because of the problems that the Jewish students, that people think that the Jewish students would have once they finish high school and go into the military. The fear from all sides seemed to be that the soldiers would be put in an untenable position if they were facing off against former friends from high school. Now, nobody that we spoke to was specific about who decided this was a problem. It did not at all seem to be a government edict or the process in making that decision. This was our first day there, so we weren't really into deep questioning. If it was later on, we would have really probed those questions, but we didn't at the time. The school does have some Jewish teachers, but that, of course, is certainly not the same thing as having your peers being from all the different religious groups. A series of schools that have been successful in integrating Christians, Muslims, and Jewish children has been the hand-in-hand schools. They were started in 1998 by Amin Khalaf and Lee Gordon. Amin Khalaf has a son that goes to Guilford College, and that was our connection with him. Because Max taught at Guilford College, he was able to make connection with him. So we had dinner with them. And the schools were started with the goal of creating a strong, inclusive, shared society through a network of Jewish-Arab integrated bilingual schools and organized communities. Currently, there are 6 such schools. One of them is in Jerusalem, with a total of 1,587 Jewish and Arab students and more than 8,000 community members. Their goal is to triple that in the next 10 years. Here's one of the classes. Smiling children, what more can you want? We met with Amin, and he said the movement is growing, but at a much slower pace than they had hoped at first. The Israelis seem to have cut themselves off almost completely from the Palestinians. Even Muslim Palestinian Israelis don't seem to interact very much with Jewish Israelis. But that is not the case between Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians. As we saw in Ibelin, where the Mar Elias school is located, and in Ramallah, a town under PA control, Palestinian Muslims and Christians associate freely and easily. In the tiny town of Aboud, outside of Ramallah, Christians and Muslims live in roughly even numbers. We met with the Greek Orthodox priest, whose name I can't remember, in the 4th century church. This church was built in the time of Constantine. And it was just amazing. And this priest, I have to say, was amazing as well. He trained in the Soviet Union as an electrical engineer. He speaks Arabic, Russian, English, Greek, and Hebrew. He lives in Ramallah, but his church is in Aboud, which is it's a 20, 25-minute drive away. And because it's all in Area A, it's not obstructed. It's interesting because there's no industry or agriculture in Aboud, and working residents commute either to Ramallah or to Jerusalem. But when it comes to religion, he says, quote, they all encourage us to live in peace with our neighbors, end quote. He said something that really hits me, and that is the devil is in the details of dogma that separate us one from another. The dogma of religions, different religions that separate us. That's where the devil is. That really hit hard to me. Ramallah is historically a Christian town, but after the 1948 Nakba, and especially since the PA made it in essence the capital of the West Bank, it is now 80% Muslim. But traditionally, the mayor of Ramallah has been a Christian, and 8 of the 15 city council members have been Christian. Now in Al-Bireh, which is its sister city, and at first there was territory between it, but now, you know, the 2 towns have grown so much, you move from one to the other without even knowing it. But in Al-Bireh, it's the opposite. The mayor is always a Muslim, and 8 of the 15 council members are always Muslim. And you know what? That's not codified in any law. That's just the way it is. And everybody is fine with it. Even though Ramallah is now 80% Muslim. It's like, we have a Christian mayor. That's the way it is. You know, they're cool with it. Everybody's fine. Now, there were some cooperative ventures that we didn't get to witness firsthand. And the most interesting one, I thought, is Tent of Nations. Max does have connections with Tent of Nations, but scheduling-wise, it just wouldn't work out. Tent of Nations sits in area, I'm not sure which, it's either B or C. And so they've had problems maintaining their existence. And Tent of Nations really is just a big farm. It's an organic farm. It's been a Palestinian, a Palestinian family has owned that farm for hundreds of years as far as they can figure out. And in fact, the Israeli Supreme Court has upheld their right to their land. And they say, at Tent of Nations, this is from their website, our mission is to build bridges between people and the land. We bring different cultures together to develop understanding and promote respect for each other and our shared environment. Now, the Israeli government has attempted to appropriate that land, but they have been unable to because there is, so much documentary evidence of who the owners actually are. And interestingly, on the hill above Tent of Nations now sits an Israeli settlement. And because of the water situation, which I will get into later, the Tent of Nations has a very hard time making sure they have enough water for their agricultural purposes and for their livestock. But the Israeli settlement has an abundance of water. They have swimming pools. They have more water than they need. And in fact, some people from the settlement have come down and seen the situation and are now advocates for Tent of Nations. So that, I think, is a very, very hopeful sign. Another organization that we didn't get to meet with, that I have contact with, is Combatants for Peace. And I only have contacts with them because we showed a film produced about them at the New York Peace Film Festival 3 or 4 years ago. It was formed in 2006, and it's Israeli and Palestinian former combatants, people who had taken an active role in the conflict, who have laid down their weapons and established this organization, Combatants for Peace. It's binational, it's a grassroots organization founded on the belief that the cycle of violence can only be broken when Israelis and Palestinians join forces. So they are working together on projects to bring unity to both peoples. And then another organization, which is actually worldwide, that has an office in Jerusalem, is Kids for Peace. It brings Muslim, Jewish, and Christian children together for crafts and games and activities to break down the stereotypes of the other and to show them that all of us are people. All of us are just human beings. And as the kids are engaged in one room, their parents are in another room trying to learn the same thing about each other. So I found that very, very hopeful. We met with an Israeli and a Palestinian who both have lost young daughters to the violence. One was killed in a suicide bombing, the other was a victim of a sniper. There was no rhyme or reason to their deaths. These are the two parents. But the death of those girls was devastating to their parents. And there wasn't a dry eye among all of us as they told their stories of what their children were like and how they met their death. We were all in tears. Their deaths happened a decade apart. But the two parents said, "We don't want you to be pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian. But we demand of you to be pro-peace." We had high hopes of meeting Hanan Ashrawi at the PLO, as she was a graduate of the Ramallah French School, but at the last minute, she was unavailable. Instead, we met with Salem Barameh of the Culture Information Department. He's young, obviously, a graduate of Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. He grew up in Jerusalem, and he said that every time he would hear a siren, he would, of course, duck, run for cover. He was afraid that something terrible was going to happen. His first week at Lawrence University, he was walking on campus, and he hears a siren. He feels his body tense, his heart rate jump, but he stopped himself and said, "Wait a minute, I don't think I'm in any trouble here. I don't think there's any danger here." Now, with him was a young woman who actually attended the Ramallah Friends School. As you can see, obviously, these were two people that are set up to present the best faces to this American Quaker group. And their task and their talk was extremely predictable, a lot of pablum they fed us, nothing interesting, nothing really out of the ordinary. But by this time, we had learned question. And so we really tried to press Salem about where the two-state solution stands. Because the PLO, of course, their stated line is the two-state solution. And so that's, of course, what they have to defend as a representative of the PLO. But we were able to question them. And finally, he said, "You know, we are also people and deserve life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For me, I don't care if it's one state or two states. I just want to be free." Okay. This is where I get to talk about what I saw, really. we went to half a dozen families whose children were being educated at the Friends School. And almost every one of those graduates are going to school in the United States and then not going back. And sometimes their parents are following them. The parents, we asked them, this doesn't bode well for Palestine. They said, yes, we know, but we want our children to have a secure life. And they're not going to have it here. Now, this, I want to make it very clear, this is not a cross-section of the Palestinian people. The Friends School is the most expensive school to send your kid to in Palestine. The most. And this is a beef I have with Friends School across the country, not only in Palestine, but here too. We've turned into elite schools, and that's not good. But that's a whole nother discussion. But through questioning other people, there are 6 different Christian denominations in Ramallah, and they all have schools, and they all educate a majority of Muslim kids along with their own. And they are all experiencing the exact same thing. A high percentage of these school kids are going to school outside of Palestine. A lot of them are going into European schools and things like that, and they're not returning. And they're not returning because it's not a secure environment to raise a family. It's not a secure environment to live. And this is problematic when your top people are leaving. Brain drain, whatever you want to call it. It's very problematic. So that's the first thing we realized. Now, interestingly, talking with Mona and a couple of other Israelis, that's not happening on the Israeli side. They are, Mona had 5 kids, has 5 kids, and they are all staying. They are all well integrated into their society and all finding a place and security. So that's what's happening on the Palestinian side, not on the Israeli side. The other thing that I really have noticed from the Palestinians is that ideology is blocking practical improvements that would make people's lives easier. So let's talk about water. Over 600,000 Jewish settlers have moved into the West Bank since 1967. Now, the West Bank produces on average 800 million liters of water per year. And 3/4 of that, 600 million liters of water, is earmarked for settler use. The 2.8 million Palestinians use strict rationing and purchasing water on the black market in order to meet their water needs. Not fair, right? Well, the Oslo Accords specify a joint water authority between Palestinians and Israel. But the Palestinians refuse to participate because they say Israelis will only approve Palestinian projects if the Palestinians approve settler projects, and the Palestinians reject the legality of the settler presence and therefore would not approve any projects to benefit them. So what's the outcome of that? The outcome is that Israel ends up making all the decisions. So how is the PA helping the Palestinians by taking that stance? And isn't there a stance that can be taken that forces them to talk? Water. Solar. I'm a Green Party member. I'm a big solar person. The Oslo Accords divided the West Bank into 3 areas, Area A, B, and C, with the varying degrees of Palestinian authorities until a final agreement is reached, which was supposed to be in the year 1999. Well, we know where that went. In Area A, where the major population, major Palestinian population centers are, the Palestinians have pretty much complete civil control. Area B, it is supposedly shared, and Area C, the Israelis have administrative control. Although Area C is by far the largest land-wise, it only has 286,000 of the 2.8 million Palestinians living in it. So Area C is also where most of the arable land is, by the way. Ramallah, of course, is in Area A, and the PA ostensibly has full authority there. So I was struck by the 2 resources that the West Bank has in abundance. It has sun and it has stone. Why, I asked Mr. Shataya, the Minister of Infrastructure, Hasn't solar power been exploited in Ramallah and throughout Area A, where the PA does have authority? Okay, you can't do it in Area C. The Israelis won't let you. But you have Area A. You are in control of Area A. Why isn't there solar panels on every building? We were in Palestine for 15 days. We did not see one cloud in the sky. And I am told that that's the way it is for 10 and a half months out of the year. That should be solar right down the line. Well, we can't do it because of this, and we can't do it because of that, and financing is a problem. Are you telling me that West Germany, the leader in the solar panel, the solar industry, would not partner with the Palestinians to bring solar power to Ramallah? I don't buy that. I just don't buy that. What I saw time and time again at the second camp that we were in as well, and that is a lot of posturing, a lot of ideological struggling going on, but not incremental steps to help the people on the ground. Corruption. One of the families we had dinner with, the father was a businessman. He operated a high-end shoe store. And he complained about the high level of corruption at every level of government, especially now that the PA was in charge. Everybody wants their cut, he said, and it makes it difficult for businesses to survive. The Friends Lower School principal happens to be married to the Ramallah city manager. Now, we had dinner there. They live in basically a mansion, by the way. He denied any corruption on the local level. But as we pressed, he conveniently disappeared. And his brother came, who lived in the United States for 16 years, and we had a wonderful conversation with him. But of course, he wasn't able to talk about problems of corruption in the PA or in the Ramallah city government. So obviously, the guy who could was not comfortable talking about this subject. Now, Salam, you remember the young guy at the PLO, was a little more resigned about the whole thing and a little more honest about it, I thought. Without elections on a national level, there is no accountability, so corruption thrives. The PA hasn't had elections since 2005, and they cite the fragmentation of their territory as the reason that it is logistically impossible to conduct elections. Really, in the computer age, it's impossible to conduct national elections, even though the area is fragmented? You know, somebody isn't doing their homework here. So, in the local elections that Salam had just been able to cast a ballot in, he was very good, he felt very good about their ability to hold their local politicians to account and to keep corruption from developing. Cooperation. Cooperation is not happening between the major antagonists, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that's where cooperation has to happen. We saw a lot of cooperation between Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims, a lot of cooperation on that level, but not between Israelis and Palestinians. I assume that they exist, but we did not speak to any Muslims or Christians who did not oppose the Israeli occupation. So it seems to be a blanket statement you can make that Palestinians oppose the occupation regardless of their religious affiliation. And then we have what is called the apartheid state. Akia Sach, the person from Breaking the Silence, told us that if an Israeli throws a stone at a Palestinian, it is rarely, that Israeli is rarely held accountable. And if they were to be held accountable, they would be brought to a civil court, brought up on charges in a civil court. But if a Palestinian, even a 12-year-old, throws a stone at an Israeli, that person is always brought up for trial, and not in a civilian court, in a military court. On the West Bank, Israeli settlers live under civilian control and civilian court system, whereas the Palestinians, who are native to the area, live under military rule. In other words, they live under a military regime. In Area B and C, Palestinians petition to open new businesses or to develop their property or to build a house or to put solar panels on, but the Israelis rarely grant the permit to allow it. On the other hand, the settlers have a free hand to develop anything as they see fit within the territory that the military has decided they can work within. In the West Bank, 30 Palestinian quarries have been shut down. Remember I said that the second resource that they have is stone, beautiful stone. But 30 Palestinian quarries have been shut down by the Israelis, all of them actually. And the Israelis have opened 10 of their own quarries in the area. Now actually that's against international law because they are considered an occupying country, power, and an occupying power is not allowed to open businesses or things like that that benefits them on occupied territory. The movement of Palestinians is strictly controlled through designated roads, through roadblocks, and prohibited areas. Israelis have special highways just built for them that only they are allowed on, and unrestricted access to any place in the West Bank they want to go. Now the future. Not only did we hear about Israelis being separated from Palestinians, but within the Palestinian communities, young Palestinians are out of touch with each other because of the segmentation of the land. One of the groups that is trying to do something about that is the American Friends Service Corporation, which is over there, and they are developing programs that will hopefully keep young Palestinians in contact with each other so they can help each other. Palestinians from one area, yes, okay. This makes any joint effort impossible. And if you're an occupying power, you might think that this would be a good thing. So it's within the realm of my mind that this was intentional on the Israeli point of view, although, you know, we don't know. And we didn't have an opportunity to ask anybody about that. Obviously, Israeli youth are militarized by going into the IDF, but the Palestinians are also being militarized. On our fourth night there, we were on the streets of Ramallah as evening fell on the final day of Ramadan. It was a wonderful celebration. I've never been to Mardi Gras, but it seemed to me that this was Mardi Gras without all the ribald stuff, you know, with a very, you know, non-sexual, no nudity, you know, but it was incredibly celebratory. It was just wonderful to watch. Everyone was just joyful. I guess they were happy the fast was over. We stopped to watch as an organized parade took place. But as it progressed, I got more and more depressed because I saw group after group of young people in uniforms marching in formation with banners and drums, all in step and all looking very military. It went on and encompassed every segment of society and every age level. This does not bode well. What will bring about change? In my observation of human nature, people only make radical change under two circumstances. One is when there is a genuine conversion experience, something that just changes your orientation completely. That happens to individuals, that happens, but not very often. The second way that radical change takes place is when the situation is so unbearable that change has to be made in order to survive. At this point in time, the Israelis are not hurting. They're inconvenienced a little bit, but they are very comfortable. They're very comfortable. And the Palestinian elite, those who are associated with the PLO or the PA, and also the upper echelons of society, They are very comfortable. We were in Ramallah, in new neighborhoods. There were mansions. They were mansions. These are not people that are hurting at all. And these are the decision makers. Because there are no elections now. And so until everybody is hurting, there's not going to be change, people. The only person that's hurting are the Palestinian common people. And they have no voice. They only have a gun. I would conclude with the full quote from our bereaved parent, but I can't without crying, so I'm not going to do that. Here are some things that I want you to consider going to, Googling. Steve Feldman was one of the people on our trip. He was raised Orthodox Jewish, and he has started an online Museum of the Promised Land, telling the story of the Palestinians from Israeli sources. And one of those sources are this. The Israeli Defense Force Intelligence Branch, a few months after the war in 1948, put out an analysis of why the Arabs left. It's very enlightening. Basically, there were three reasons. We forced them at gunpoint, we scared them to death, or they were so afraid they just left. But anyway, Mustafa Barghouti, the guy I think that has the most chance intellectually should be president of a united Israel and Palestine, has put out a video called Our Story. I suggest you look at it. It's an hour. It's oftentimes very difficult to watch, but it's good. And then everybody, friend or non-friend, what I mean by that is Quaker or non-Quaker, consider joining Max and Jane next year for the trip. There is a lot of walking, so if you have physical problems, it might be difficult. But I do say that the most difficult for me was listening to all the different points of view, trying to make sense of all the different points of view, and being open and being willing to listen. Thank you for listening to me. I know I've droned on for over an hour. I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm also happy to facilitate a discussion. Questions?
Did you get any idea of what Palestinians thought of the present U.S. government?
Not of the well, yes, in fact, we did. One of the people that joined us for a day was an Israeli settler from a settlement around Jerusalem, not Mona, but somebody named Teddy, I can't remember his name. But he joined us for a day, and he said, in one conversation, he said, confidentially, at our settlement meeting, shortly after Trump was elected, our settlement president said, now's the time to build. To what extent is the Palestinian economy supported by remittance from families that live abroad or from governments that are contributing from abroad? And my sense is, though we didn't ask for numbers, my sense is that the two major revenue streams are remittances from Israel and remittances from foreign countries. We did not hear of a lot of money coming to Palestine from Palestinians who live abroad, unlike in Israel, where a lot of money comes to Israel from Jewish people who live abroad. But we didn't hear, that doesn't mean that it's not there, but we didn't hear of that.
The other thing was, you commented on the elections, which aren't being held. In 2005, those elections were held, and Hamas won the elections not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And that's why Israel then went and arrested all the delegates who belonged to Hamas and incarcerated them so that the Palestinian Authority would only be made up of people from Fatah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, Martha.
It isn't a question. It's getting back to that little map that you had of Gaza.
Oh, okay.
No, leave it.
Okay,
leave it.
okay.
If you notice that the fourth one, there was that little bit of white on
Yes.
the coastline?
Yes.
Okay. So Israel is preventing the Gazan fishermen from fishing in those waters.
Right.
So it is denying them access to their own water. The other thing that's not much talked about is that there is a huge reserve of natural gas in that water that belongs to Gaza that Israel is fracking into and accessing and taking. So, not that I'm a proponent of natural gas, it is a resource that belongs to Gaza that the Israelis are stealing.
And probably not distributing
Certainly
or
not.
Gee.
proceeds or anything.
Thank you so much for coming in.